The wisdom of saying yes to boundaries in marriage is one of the most counterintuitive things we've ever learned because most people hear the word boundaries and immediately picture walls, distance, or someone pulling away. But after 23 years of getting this wrong, before we got it right, we've come to see that boundaries are actually what protect love. In this video, we're going to walk you through what healthy boundaries actually look like, why your nervous system might be fighting against them, and how saying yes to boundaries can completely change how connected you feel, especially if autism or ADHD is part of your relationship. If you're new here, I'm Ryan. I'm on the autistic spectrum, and Lori and I make videos about building stronger relationships based on what we've experienced over the years, not from a textbook.
And I'm Lori, Ryan's wife. I have ADHD and have been married for over 23 years. So everything we share comes from our own experience and what actually started to work after we stopped pretending we had all figured it out.
We had to learn a lot of this the hard way, so we want to share what helped us with you. We're not therapists or counselors, just a real couple sharing what we've learned. And if your relationship ever feels unsafe or abusive, please reach out to a qualified professional for help.
So the first thing I want to talk about might not be what you think of when you hear boundaries, because most people jump straight to boundaries between two people, and we'll get there. But the first boundaries I had to learn about were the ones that protect your marriage from the outside world. Here's where this came from for me. Ryan was raised in a small, quiet farm. I was raised in a family where 9 of us lived in a relatively small house. And my alone time growing up was in the bathroom, and that was literally it. When I became a mom, I was also rarely alone either, and I was accustomed to that. It felt weird to spend any time by myself. We both felt strongly that our kids needed time with both of us, especially when they were young. Now that our kids are almost all grown, we know time with your family is precious, and that truth hits us hard. Setting boundaries around external distractions is one of the most loving things you can do for your marriage.
And what makes that hard is that the outside world is really good at not feeling like a threat. Work isn't trying to hurt your marriage, neither is your hobby or your church or your extended family, but all of them will take whatever time you let them have. And honestly, if you can already feel something pulling at your marriage, but can't quite name what's actually creating the tension between you, we put together a free relationship friction quiz that's designed to help you figure that out. It walks you through a few simple questions and points you at the specific pattern that's behind the friction you're feeling. The link is right in the description below. Head down there and take a few minutes whenever you have some time.
Now back to where I was. Here's where the light bulb went off for me. Saying yes to boundaries isn't only about limits between you and your spouse. Sometimes it's about protecting the time you have together from everything else that pulls at it. Because if you don't protect that time, no one else will. Here's a question I want you to think about while you're watching, because we're going to ask you to share your answers later. What is the one thing that consistently steals time from your marriage that you wish you'd put a boundary around years ago? Hang on to that.
Up on this really early on in our marriage, kind of by accident. I heard one of the men at church who had about 20 years on me talk about how he and his wife went out on a date every single Friday night, no matter what. Something about that just stuck with me. So I decided right then and there that I was going to do the same thing. I set a boundary really early on in our marriage to protect Friday date night. That was a yes to us.
And honestly, that one boundary has held our marriage together more than either of us realized at the time. Even when we didn't feel like going out, we often went out. A bonus for autistic tendencies, following routines to a T.
I also held a firm boundary against working overtime. And I admit, as an autistic engineer, that sounds slightly out of character. Anyone who knows me would expect me to be the guy who stays late finishing every detail. But even back when I was an engineering student with 3 little kids and Lori running a day home, I could have stayed late every night at school. And a lot of my classmates did, but I decided I needed to be home by 5. We'd have dinner as a family, and then once the kids were in bed, I'd pull the homework back out. Same thing early in my engineering career. Being home with my family after my paid hours were up mattered more than extra work that probably wouldn't get noticed anyway. So to this day, I rarely work overtime. I see my job as a way to support my family, not my family as something to support my job.
And what we want you to hear is that boundaries are not about restricting your spouse. The most important boundaries in our marriage have been the ones that Ryan has set against parts of his own life that could quietly pull him away from me.
Because if you start with boundaries that protect the relationship, the boundaries between you and your spouse get a lot easier. You're already on the same team.
Okay, now the harder part, the boundaries between us as a couple. This one is deeply personal for any couple. And I'll be honest, this is the sensitive one,
It really is. Even how we talk about it on camera has to be its own boundary.
right? We're not going to share every personal detail about our intimate life with the internet. So, this whole conversation, we're approaching it with a boundary of its own, which feels appropriate given the topic. Here's something I wish I'd understood much earlier. And I'm not going to call it traditional Christian values because I don't think that's what it actually is. I think it is an old, outdated, patriarchal social order that trained older generations to believe a woman should just submit. The women weren't quite full people. The women existed to nurture and cater to the men and the children in their lives without much thought for their own needs.
So, metaphorically, that is the water that a lot of us are still swimming in without even realizing it. And it took us a long time to really see how much of that was sitting underneath our marriage.
I'm allowed to have an opinion and I'm allowed to say no thanks when I'm not on board with something. Now, I've had to learn to say that no in a clear but kind way. And sometimes I can give a reason for that no, and sometimes I can't. There are honestly times I don't even know the reason. I just know that my body and my spirit is telling me. And Ryan has had to learn to respect that no, even without an explanation, because the feelings are real, even when I don't have words for them. I can set a healthy boundary and still expect safe understanding and courtesy in return.
And I want to acknowledge how long that took me because, as an autistic guy who needs clear, logical reasons for things, a no without an explanation used to feel impossible to accept. My brain wanted the data, it wanted the why. And it took years for me to understand that demanding a reason from her every time was actually a way of putting her on trial for her own boundary. That wasn't respect, that was negotiation.
And here's what every couple watching needs to hear. Please. Marriage does not remove the need for consent. Boundaries affirm that each person still has full autonomy over their body, their emotions, and their comfort. And respecting those boundaries strengthens dignity inside the relationship. It doesn't weaken it. When boundaries are ignored, trust erodes quietly, sometimes for years before anyone realizes what happened. When boundaries are honored, trust gets deeper, and so does intimacy.
That was really hard for me to learn because for a long time I kind of operated under the assumption that we were married, so the boundary conversation was already settled.
And that assumption nearly cost us.
It did. I want to come back to that specific moment that broke that assumption open because that was one of the most painful realizations of our marriage. But I'll save that for later. What I had to start doing was actually having the conversations we'd never had before.
And the conversation I wish we had had at the beginning.
And asking things like, what helps you feel close? What makes you feel uncomfortable? What do you need emotionally before physical intimacy can feel meaningful? As an autistic guy, those are not conversations I would have naturally gravitated to. I'd much rather have a clearer set of rules and follow them. But marriage doesn't work like that.
The conversation has to keep happening because what helps me feel close at 28 is not the same as what helps me feel close at 45. Stress, parenting, illness, hormones, life pressures, all of it affects intimacy.
And marriage is unity, but it's not the loss of self. Healthy boundaries let each person stay a whole person inside the marriage. Without that, one or both partners start feeling pressured, neglected, or slowly disconnected. And no one knows when it started.
Lasting marriage is all of this. It just feels like one day you're roommates, but don't panic. It just shouldn't be that way all of the time. To quote The Princess Bride, life is pain, Highness. Anyone who says differently is selling you something. In a healthy marriage, we don't want to cause pain. We need to help one another out of it. Okay, this is the most important part of the video, especially if either of you is neurodivergent. This is a missing piece, misunderstood and uncomprehended by neurotypicals.
Here's what I had to learn the hard way. Someone saying no to you does not mean you are less. It doesn't mean you're being rejected. It doesn't mean you've done something wrong. But for a lot of autistic and ADHD people, that's not how a no lands in our nervous system. And until I understood why, I was making a really painful pattern, even worse without knowing it. A few things are happening when we hear no. First, autistic thinking can be more all or nothing. So instead of hearing not right now, the brain hears never or you're rejected. It collapses a soft no into a permanent verdict.
Second, a lot of neurodivergent people have a long history of feeling misunderstood, corrected, or excluded. So a simple no from your spouse can trigger old feelings of hurt much more intensely than the person saying it would ever expect. They're saying no to one thing, you're hearing no to an entire history of feelings like you are not enough or that you are not right.
Third, autism often comes with a strong need for predictability. If I had an expectation about how a moment was going to go, a sudden no can feel genuinely dysregulating, like the plan had collapsed and my brain was scrambling to shift gears. And big emotions hit before there are any words for them. So hurt comes out as frustration, shutdown, or what looks like anger instead of calm words. To step further into this, there's also demand sensitivity, which a lot of ADHD and autistic folks both deal with. Hearing a no can trigger a nervous system threat response, a feeling of losing autonomy, even when no harm was intended. For some autistic people, that demand avoidance goes so far as pathological demand avoidance. A no or a not yet answer can cause complete shutdown when trying to just walk through basic life.
And I have to be honest about what that looked like from my side. Ryan's reaction to my no before we understood any of this could make her connection so much worse until he learned how to regulate his disappointment. I felt upset about being taken advantage of. I felt horrible, like I was married to someone who was emotionally immature. And yes, there were times I felt manipulated and coerced, like his needs were more important than mine. That wasn't who he or I wanted to be. That wasn't who he was in any other area of his life. But because of how his nervous system reacted to a no, it kept showing up as that pattern.
And in close relationships, intimacy can be deeply tied to connection, reassurance, and emotional safety. So a no can get interpreted emotionally as you don't want me, rather than simply not at this moment, please.
But here's what we both came to understand. Understanding why no feels hard does not mean boundaries should be ignored. Distress is real. We honor that, but another person's consent still matters. So the work is learning to separate I feel rejected or dysregulated right now from someone has set a boundary and there's nothing wrong with that. I think we should repeat that.
Yeah. So learning to separate, I feel rejected or dysregulated right now, from someone has set a boundary. Once you can tell the difference between those two things, everything changes.
And if everything we've been describing so far is sounding familiar, but you can't quite tell which part of this is the biggest issue for your relationship, that's exactly what our free relationship friction quiz was built to help you figure out. It will show you the specific patterns that's creating the most tension between you, so you know where to actually start. Head to the description and grab it there.
I want to come back to something I touched on earlier, because nobody talks about this one. Boundaries to set against yourself. As an autistic guy, I have a strong, almost innate need for alone time. That's how I regulate myself. On the surface, you might think the boundary I need is the one that protects my alone time from my spouse. That would be the most obvious autistic move, but that's not the boundary I actually need. The boundary I need is the opposite. My natural tendency is to spend too much time alone, so I set boundaries against that. Date night Fridays is part of that. Choosing to sit and talk with Lori instead of disappearing into my own head. That's a boundary I have to actively set with myself.
And he holds those boundaries even when his brain is asking for the opposite, which is harder than it sounds for an autistic person.
Honestly, I think Lori has more natural boundaries between her and I than I have between us. So part of my job is to respect her boundaries. After a day or week of her job, she is wiped out. I learned that the normal thing to do for normal people when your spouse gets home is to give her a hug and ask her how her day went the second she walks in the door.
But I'm honestly rather put out by all of that when I'm verging on burnout.
So instead of crowding her and then feeling rejected when she pulls away, I give her space. I usually bring her a drink, one of those flavored carbonated water she likes, and then I let her have the space and quiet that she needs.
I want to say something here because a lot of partners watching are probably in that role that I was in for a long time, where you're being asked for connection in the exact moment you have the least to give. And it's not because you don't love them, it's that you are literally tapped out. Ryan learned to read that and now just leaves me alone for 20 minutes. This was one of the most loving boundaries he's ever set on my behalf. He didn't make me set it. He noticed it and held it for me. He sometimes even shields me from the kids' attention and asks someone to tidy up before I get home. And that kind of boundary work is beautiful in a relationship.
Okay, so the last one is a combination of everything else we've been talking about. And this is probably the hardest part of the whole video. So I'm just going to be honest about where we used to be. One of the biggest challenges in our marriage for a long time was the gap between what I wanted physically and Lori trying to hold her boundaries. And what made that so much harder was something I now understand as rejection sensitivity. I've always been highly sensitive to being told no. Couple that with how intensely I lock onto something that I want, and you have a recipe for some real struggle. And so here's what that looks like. I would want physical intimacy, often at a specific time of the week,
Because that's when I was scheduled in.
or when it was convenient. And I hadn't necessarily done the work in the relationship to make her feel safe and open to that. I'd make advances. She'd give body language saying no, but this matters for any neurodivergent couple watching. I wouldn't always read body language as a direct no. I need clear, direct communication. So after a while, one of two things would happen. Either she'd give in, which builds up real resentment, or she'd say no out loud, and then I'd react in a rather dejected way.
Some could say pout.
But being highly sensitive to rejection, I took her refusal personally, and that fear of feeling that pain actually kept me from being honest about what I wanted in the first place. Either way, it created distance between us. And I have to name something else here because it matters. I was pushing for physical intimacy in a way I shouldn't have been. I wasn't doing the things in the rest of the marriage that would have made her feel safe and loved. So when I was ready, she wasn't. I would still keep making advances. Often she would just give in. That satisfied me in the moment, but it created resentment in her, hurt our relationship, and created real emotional distance between us that took years to undo.
And I lived this from the other side. There were times when I said yes, when I shouldn't have. I said yes because I wanted him to feel loved by me. I said yes because I didn't want to deal with the dejection or the pouting. I said yes because I told myself I didn't matter that much. But every time I said, okay, fine, that was not really a yes, it was a no. I moved a little further away from him, and I didn't even fully recognize it as resentment at the time. It just kept building. And eventually, I was at the point where the distance felt better than the closeness. That's how serious this gets when boundaries aren't honored. You can technically stay married and become completely disconnected. If there was something that almost broke our marriage, this was it. I became numb, performing for him, what I internally didn't accept. And I knew that I could walk away and be a better, more complete person for it, or we could fix it together.
So what changed? A few things. First, a shout out to our marriage counselor, Michael. It's okay to find outside help. I now work on creating a kind of safe, loving environment where intimacy comes naturally, not pushed, not pried out, just available when we're actually connected. Second, I respect her boundaries, even when those boundaries are ad hoc and show up as her saying she's tired or she has a headache or her gut isn't feeling good. I know what those mean now, and it's a no I take at face value. I've also learned that her no in those moments has nothing to do with me as a person. She still loves me. She still cares about me deeply. It's just that it's not in the cards tonight. And finally, I've learned that as I consistently meet her emotional needs, she looks to meet my needs for physical intimacy. That sequence matters.
Not just his physical intimacy needs, but mine too. I have those. But yes, the sequence matters, and intimacy is way more than just physical intimacy. So we asked you a question earlier, and I want to come back to it. What's the one thing that consistently steals time from your marriage that you wish you'd put a boundary around years ago? Drop your answer in the comments. We read them. And sometimes just seeing it written out by other couples helps you realize you are not the only one dealing with this. So, if there's one thing we want you to take away, it's that boundaries are not walls. They are not rejection. They are guidelines that protect love. Boundaries don't say, I love you less. They say, I want our love to be safe, respectful, and sustainable.
So pick one. Pick the smallest boundary you've been avoiding and try saying yes to it this week. Maybe it's protecting one evening together. Maybe it's giving your spouse 20 minutes of space when they walk in the door. Start there and watch what happens to the connection between you. And one last thing before we wrap up. If a lot of what we've shared today is hitting closer to home than you expect, head down to the description below and take our free relationship friction quiz. It will help you identify exactly where the tension in your relationship is coming from, and it gives you a customized result with a free ebook to help you walk through that specific pattern. It's not neurotype specific, so any couple can take it, and it only takes a few minutes. Now that you can see how setting boundaries together is actually what makes a marriage stronger rather than weaker, you might be wondering, what was actually making those boundaries so hard to set in the first place? For us, a lot of it came back to old beliefs we'd both absorbed about what a husband is supposed to be and what a wife is supposed to be. Beliefs we never really consciously signed on to, but that were shaping everything underneath. That's exactly what we break down in this next video. Watch this one here, because when you pair what you just learned about boundaries with the 5 specific gender role lies we covered in this video, a lot of what's been going wrong between you is going to start making a lot more sense. Thanks for watching, and remember, even neurodivergent couples can make relationships work.